Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. So I'm John Ahlquist, and on behalf of the students, the staff, the faculty of the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS, where you're sitting, I'm really excited to welcome you to another event as part of our San Diego 2049 series. So I'm faculty here at GPS. I see a couple of my colleagues in the audience. Just by show of hands, students or alumni of GPS? A couple of you guys in the audience? Fantastic, glad to see you. And I'm glad to see we're also attracting outside of our own little insular group to come and visit us and talk more. So for those of you who don't know about GPS, we are a professional school. We're UCSD's International Affairs and Public Policy School. So we grant primarily master's degrees in those fields, as well as some more specialized one, for example, a master's in Chinese economic and political affairs, as well as some executive degrees. And this year is the 30th anniversary of GPS. And we are interested in training the policymakers of tomorrow to address the hard and interesting questions that are going to be arising in the future, not just necessarily looking backwards at the past. And so part of what we're doing with San Diego 2049 is putting our students, our faculty, and our school in contact with other strengths around UCSD, especially around design thinking, world building, science fiction, and the humanities, to try to stimulate and build this kind of future forward-looking thinking along the lines of celebrating our 30th anniversary by looking for the next 30 years. And in particular, we're having events all year long centering on three themes, which are crafting 21st century policy, fusing technology and policy, and navigating an evolving political economy. And as with all of our 2049 events, San Diego 2049 events, the event tonight actually crosses all three of those. So fits perfectly. Let me just quickly say a little bit about the broader context of the San Diego 2049 project and events. What we're doing is, as I said, we're trying to link these different disparate aspects of the UCSD campus together and also reach out into the community and bring you all in, and so you can see what we're doing and how we're trying to stimulate thinking among our students and across the different units on campus, with a particular focus on building practice and ways of thinking about hard problems that are yet to come, or states of the world that we might want to actually avoid, in trying to make conscious and directed policy decisions to try to avoid those things or to get us to a better place. So we partnered with the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, and they've been helping us put on these events all year long, where we've had a series of fabulous speakers come and talk to us, as well as people come and work with our teams of graduate students who at the end of the year are going to be presenting their own projects, which are going to be small, we're calling them interventions in the future, aspects of the San Diego region that might happen in 30 years, in trying to tell us a story about what would be the policy, political, social, economic, technological environment that would be embodied in that story or that object. So with that in mind, I am thrilled to introduce our speaker, Annalee Newitz, who's visiting us. She has already an established career as a science fiction writer as well as a nonfiction writer. Many of you might know her for her most recent book, Autonomous, which was nominated for the Nebula and Locus Awards. She's also won the Lambda Literary Award. Been a science journalist for the Washington Post, for Slate, for Ars Technica, for the New Yorker and the Atlantic, among others. Yet another podcast co-hoster. The podcast is Our Opinions Are Correct, and she's also been a founder of IO9 and served as editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. So I'm going to turn it over to Annalee. She's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and conversations with all of you. All right. So with that, I will turn it over to Annalee.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me here. It's great to finally visit UC San Diego, because one of my favorite science fiction novels, Rainbow's End by Vernor Vinge, has an amazing virtual reality battle outside the library on this campus. And so when I came here, I was like, okay, I got to go see if the library is Terry Pratchett style or Pokemon style. And if you read the book, you'll find out. It's probably not either one at this point. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically, so I tend to work at the intersection between fiction and nonfiction. I do science journalism, which as journalists, we try our best to tell the truth. We're at a point in history where that's kind of a subject of contention, but we try to be as truthful and accurate as possible. And then I also write science fiction where, of course, all I'm doing is making shit up. But the two things tend to overlap for me. I usually write books in pairs that are one nonfiction, one fiction that kind of cover similar topics, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what I want to talk about today is a particular trend in how we think about dystopia and dystopian fiction and how we interpret it, and try to offer a new way of thinking about how dystopian fiction works, and maybe correct some of the misunderstandings about dystopia, and suggest a way to kind of get away from dystopian thinking, if possible. And so that's going to be a little bit about, that's going to be a little of what I'm going to be talking about. As I said, I tend to write books in pairs. So my most recent books have been focused on how humans are going to survive into the future, but also screw up a lot along the way. Scatter, Adapt, and Remember was a nonfiction book that I wrote about mass extinction on our planet and the impending mass extinction that we are probably about to face. And in that book, I did a lot of work talking to scientists about how we might try to mitigate a lot of the problems that we were creating using biotech and using green technology. And a lot of that biotech and green technology shows up in Autonomous, my science fiction novel, which I'll talk about more later. So, okay, let's get back to dystopia. So one of the biggest misconceptions about science fiction in general is that it's predictive, that the reason why we write science fiction, the reason we read science fiction is because we want to find out what's going to happen tomorrow. So far, none of the science fiction writers I know are wizards, and we cannot actually predict the future. So what are we actually doing when we write a science fiction story? We're talking about the present. And I'm not the first person to make this observation. It's actually a very long-standing sort of assertion about science fiction. But if this goes for science fiction, if we can say that science fiction that's about the future is really about the present, we can also say that dystopia is not really a warning about the future, it's a warning about the present. And I have a character here from The Handmaid's Tale. How many people have watched The Handmaid's Tale, at least a little bit? So The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopian science fiction TV series. It's based on a dystopian novel by Margaret Atwood that came out in the 1980s. And it's about a dark world where women lose reproductive rights and are also unable to earn money anymore. So they certainly are earning less than half of what men make. And it's about a takeover of the United States by an extreme right-wing religious regime. And they rename the United States Gilead. And when Handmaid's Tale came out, at a time right after our most recent presidential election, people sort of said at that moment, oh wow, this is just what we need. We really need a dystopia about this kind of dark world that could happen if women's rights are taken away and if reproductive freedoms are taken away. And then quickly, we all kind of realized that we'd actually rather be watching like Steven Universe or Black Panther because those were a lot more, a lot less dark. But let me talk about what Handmaid's Tale actually is doing, which is, as I said earlier, it's talking about issues today. And again, with dystopias, which are just dark visions, usually of the future, oftentimes if you ask an author, well, why did you write this horrible, mean story where characters are horribly abused and live in a terrible, oppressive world, they'll say, well, I'm warning about what could happen. It's a warning. But as I said, Handmaid's Tale is a warning about what is happening now. We are seeing rollbacks in reproductive rights. We're seeing women lose rights that they had. We're seeing an upswelling in kind of anti-woman sentiment in our elections and things like that. We're seeing lots of progress, but we're also seeing lots of signs that that progress is very precarious. So I think that this is a great example of how we see dystopias talking about the present moment. There's another really interesting dystopian TV show that a lot of people have been chattering about on the internet, which is where I live, which is Black Mirror, which is a British show. It's an anthology show, so it's sort of like Twilight Zone. Each episode is its own little story. And it's on its, I want to say 4th or 5th season at this point. They're very short seasons. I highly recommend you check it out. And it's basically, again, it's looking at a dark future. A lot of the episodes, not all, but a lot of them have to do with social media and the kind of dark places that social media can take us. And again, it's set, often the episodes are set nominally in a future. It's kind of like the old show Max Headroom, if any of you remember Max Headroom. If you remember the 80s, it was a great, such a freaking great show. It was a great cyberpunk show, and the tagline for it was 5 minutes into the future. And of course, it's way more than 5 minutes in the future, but it's this idea that it's this sort of indeterminate moment in the future. So Black Mirror is like that. It's 5 minutes into the future. And there's all kinds of permutations of social media drives us to murder people. Social media drives us to abuse people. It causes us to have all kinds of privacy invasions that are, I'm not going to give you spoilers, I'm just going to tell you, it is a seriously fucked up show, and it will make you feel upset. And so, again, these are all the issues around social media and how social media might cause social unrest or might lead to violence. These are all issues that we're dealing with right now. Again, it's a dystopia, it's a warning, but it's not about the future. It's a warning about what's going on right now. So we also see, in the world of nonfiction, we also see storytelling which is dystopian. So it's not just something that happens in science fiction. And there's a couple works that I wanted to call out that are pretty recent. One is David Wallace Wells's new book called The Uninhabitable Earth, which you may have seen or read about, published, I think, just a couple of weeks ago. And it's about climate change and how climate change, the effects of climate change are actually going to be way worse than you thought. It's going to be just the biggest apocalypse ever, disease, cities drowning, all the stuff, right? And his thesis, which has been somewhat controversial in the scientific community, is that it's coming sooner and it's going to be worse than we ever thought, which could turn out to be true, but no one knows for sure yet. I mean, obviously we know that climate change is coming and the effects are going to be devastating, but he's arguing it's even worse. And people love it because, we love to read about destruction, especially human destruction. This is a thing over and over. Nobody wants to hear about the dog apocalypse or the cat apocalypse, but the human apocalypse, right on. We're there. Another really interesting series that's coming tomorrow, if you'd like some more apocalypse and dystopia, on Netflix, they're airing a documentary called Our Planet. It's David Attenborough, so it'll have a mellifluous voice going on underneath it. And it's being billed and has been received by critics as the first ever nature documentary that fully acknowledges climate change. So every time you see happy bees doing cute bee stuff, it's soon there will be no more bees. I don't know, this is a David Attenborough voice. I don't know how to do a David Attenborough. Imagine David Attenborough saying, soon there will be no more bees. And so the point is that it's giving us the beauty of nature, but it's a dystopian storyline. It's all about how this will be destroyed, this will be ruined, we're headed for a dead world where there's no fluffy insects that keep us alive. So then there's another genre of dystopian writing, which is about the dangers of artificial intelligence. So first we have dystopian nonfiction about the environment, how we've destroyed it and now it will destroy us. Now we also have to worry about AI. We've built AI and now it will destroy us, allegedly. So Nick Bostrom, who is a philosopher at the University of Oxford, wrote a book that's very popular in Silicon Valley circles called Superintelligence, which is about how we're going to invent machines that will become smarter than we are, even though nobody actually can define intelligence. Don't worry about that, because this is a partially dystopian narrative about what that will mean for us when we are essentially replaced by these putative future machines that will be smarter than we are. And then there's another genre of dystopian nonfiction about AI, which I would characterize as much more realistic, which are all about algorithms controlling our behavior and how algorithms have been, have sort of picked up all of the human biases from the data that they're using in machine learning. And so you get things like Safiya Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, which is actually a fantastic book. It is a classic dystopian narrative in that it's a warning about what's happening now, and it is showing us a very dark view of how algorithms are reproducing racism, reproducing inequality, algorithms that are being used in, say, mortgage lending or even in Google searches. She was actually the scholar who first wrote about a phenomenon which Google has since, I believe, completely fixed or mostly fixed or partially fixed, where if you searched on beautiful woman, all of the top faces you would get would be white. And it would take a lot of scrolling before you would get any brown faces. And so this was obviously something in the algorithm that was racist, that assumed that white faces were somehow more beautiful than black faces. And I don't think, you guys should do a Google search right now on beautiful women and see what happens. But I think Google read her work and tried to fix that. But it's an ongoing issue. So the problem is, okay, here was a bunch of stories I just told you about how everything sucks, okay? Like, we're all going to be handmaids. we're going to be, the handmaids, are sort of prisoners of patriarchy. So we're all going to be handmaids. We're going to be dominated by AI. And the AI will either supersede us or will just be so terrible and racist that it will make our society even more fractured and unstable than it already is. Also, the environment, by the way, is going to destroy us now that we've destroyed it. So that's dystopia, okay? That's the dystopian narrative. So the problem is, as I sort of mentioned earlier when I said, like, a lot of us watched Handmaid's Tale, and then we were just like, please, just like give us Black Panther again, because it's so much more uplifting and it's so much more happy in so many ways, even though there's a lot of problems in it too. So the trouble with dystopia is that it does offer us a warning about how things are terrible in our world, but it often leaves us feeling paralyzed. Even a story that is fictional, like Handmaid's Tale, can leave you feeling like, okay, everything sucks and there's nothing I can do. So how do we use those stories to try to plan for the future when, it's a crowded field of dystopian stories that are sort of telling us about how to get into the future or what the future is going to be like? So one possible solution that often gets talked about, especially in the sci-fi world, is, okay, let's try to write utopian stories. Let's try to write happier stories. We're going to try to get people to think about how that tomorrow will be better or things will be nicer. And there's been, it sounds kind of silly when I put it that way, but there actually has been a pretty strong effort in the science fiction writing community to do that. There were a series of anthologies which Neil Stephenson started called Hieroglyph. I wrote for the first one, which were explicitly intended to be stories that were hopeful, that were not dystopian. And actually, I just agreed to write a story for another anthology where, I agreed and I talked to the editor and she said, oh, and by the way, it has to be uplifting. And this is a new thing. Like normally, you don't tell a fiction writer like, we really need a happy ending. I mean, unless they're writing in a genre that like sort of requires a happy ending, and there are some genres like that, but not science fiction. I mean, usually science fiction, it's like, hey man, it can be like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like everybody's screwed at the end. So people are actively thinking about that. The problem with Utopia is that weirdly, so I was saying dystopia sort of pretends to be a warning about the future, but it's really kind of stuck in the present. Utopia also is like that. When you tell kind of a utopian story, it tends to be very focused on kind of present day issues. It also tends to be kind of weirdly personal, like much more personal than dystopias. Like I feel like we kind of agree on like a lot of the things that are dystopian that could happen to us, but like when you read a utopian story or a hopeful story, it often tells you things that you might not have wanted to know about the author. There's a great episode of Rick and Morty, which is a parody of the movie Inception. And so Rick and Morty, in case you don't know, Rick is a mad scientist with a foul mouth, and Morty is his long-suffering grandson. and they can hop to other dimensions. That's their power. So they somehow manage to get inside a dream, just like in the movie Inception. And once they're down, I don't even know how many layers, they're inside Rick's sex dream. And Morty is just like, oh, God, I didn't need to see that. Like, I really didn't need to see my grandfather's sex dream. And that's a little bit like what it's like reading people's utopian stories sometimes. You're just like, I didn't need to know that about you. So I have a picture here of Utopia. This is the Shire from Lord of the Rings. It's where Frodo and Bilbo live. It's where Gandalf comes to like smoke pot and hang out. Everybody smokes pot because they're always, yeah, anyway. So, and it's interesting because, Lord of the Rings was originally written, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it kind of to process a lot of what had happened to him as a soldier during World War I. So it kind of grew out of this very dystopian experience, and then he kind of creates this happy land. But in the United States, so it's a British book, and Tolkien is British, or was British. But when the book became popular in the United States, it lagged behind a lot. And so it didn't really take off in the US until the 1960s. And it was adopted pretty much immediately by hippie culture, which viewed the Shire, where the hobbits live, as a kind of utopia. And there were all these buttons that said, like, Frodo lives and Gandalf for president. And it was this idea that, the Shire was not warlike. It was, back to the land. It was this kind of natural world. And people really bought into it as a utopia. And like I said, in some ways now it feels very dated. It's like, okay, that was that utopia in the 60s. Now the Shire is like Game of Thrones. It's like we don't see it the same way anymore because now we're kind of stuck in a lot of narratives about how nature is being destroyed, and we don't feel like we have that option. However, there are some nonfiction narratives, like stuff by, say, Bill McKibben, who is an environmental activist, or Michael Pollan, who kind of promotes the idea of eating kind of natural foods. Those are both kind of utopian writers in some ways, in some of their work, kind of echoing this Shire model of utopia. Like, let's go back to the land, let's be natural. If we can do that, maybe we can prevent some of those terrible environmental changes, those dystopias where everything is destroyed. And then there's utopian narratives that are kind of the opposite of those AI dystopias that I was telling you about. Kind of techno-utopian ideas about how technology will save us and solve all of our problems. My favorite new techno-utopian thinker is Elizabeth Holmes, who was the head of Theranos. Like, I love that everybody's like, oh my God, that lady. But she is the consummate utopian thinker in this area because she was literally selling a story. And the story was, I have a tiny device that can do all of these medical tests, even though it should be physically impossible, even though all of science says no. It's like, we've solved it, we've got the thing, we've got our handheld, perfect medical device, and we're going to solve all these problems. It was literally the utopian narrative. We are going to solve all these problems with technology, and look where it got her. So it did get her like a Netflix special or something like that. Yeah, I heard it's really good. So utopia is sticky, and it can be very politically sticky because with utopia, this is true with dystopia too, but with utopia, one person's utopia is quite often another person's dystopia. So, some people might love the Shire. I have friends that would look at this picture and be like, that is not accessible. Like, I cannot get that to there with my wheelchair. No, that is not utopia. Or if you think about it politically, like, Elizabeth Warren's view of utopia is very different from Jeff Bezos's view of utopia. And in fact, if either of them were to get their utopian wish, it would literally have to crush the other person's idea of utopia. So those are two utopias that cancel each other out. And in fact, I think Amazon is many people's idea of dystopia. There's even a whole Doctor Who episode about that. There's like one person who's like, yeah. It's a good episode. We have other kinds of utopian thought in politics too. The Green New Deal is a great example of utopian thought, which many politicians think of as dystopia. A lot of people might think going to a gun show is dystopia, and other people would think it was utopia, because like, hey, you can check out all the guns and buy lots of ammo. So when we're trying to think about the future using storytelling, the question is, how do we get out of this feedback loop of either telling a dystopian story as a warning, telling a utopian story as a way to kind of correct the bad stuff in the world, but getting caught up in this problem where like my utopia is your dystopia, and also feeling like neither of those options, utopia and dystopia, are things we can actually get to. So I would argue, whoa, I just hit something. I would argue that the goal should be to think about, to use our stories to think about who actually is dreaming up the utopias and dystopias, to actually show that certain visions of the present, certain visions of tomorrow, suit one group but do not suit another group. That it's, you're like Shire, wow, it sounds great, but like I said, my friend can't get her wheelchair up to that house. And so we have to get out of the binary thinking of it's either dystopia or utopia. That's it. That's all we've got. And so what I've tried to do in my work, and I'll talk about other people who are doing this too, I don't know that I've succeeded, but what I try to do is write stories where there's an acknowledgement that the world is full of both utopian and dystopian impulses. And so in my novel Autonomous, I have it's set like 125 years in the future, but yes, it's really about the present. And I have AI, it's human equivalent. There's robots walking around that have human equivalent intelligence. There's terrific green technology. So there's still a lot of problems with climate change, but most places on Earth have switched over to sustainable energy. They're engaging in farming practices that are sustainable. It sounds kind of great, right? Like it's like, okay, we're fixing a bunch of these problems. The problem is that global governments have reinvented indentured servitude, which is basically slavery. So, and all of the characters who are indentured call it slavery. The ones who aren't, strangely, all refer to it as indenture. It's just a matter of perspective. And the reason why I chose to do this, to have one aspect of the world be incredibly advanced in ways that we kind of dream about, like having better medicines and having better sources of energy, but also having kind of slid backwards into older models of oppression, is that I wanted to emphasize that some things get better and some things get worse. Like that's kind of how the future works, that's how the past works. We never actually solve everything. There's no perfect tomorrow. There's getting better in one way, and then maybe you have to go back and resolve the problem that we thought we'd solved already with slavery. It turns out that problem wasn't solved, and that's why it came back. And the sneaky, nasty way that indenture comes back is that robots in this world, these human equivalent creatures, they have a bit of a robot rights movement. It doesn't happen in the book, it's kind of in the past. And they've advocated for the idea that they're human equivalent and they should have human rights. However, because it costs money to manufacture a robot, this global entity, which is kind of like the UN, determines that the company or entity that builds a robot can hold it in indenture for 10 years, just so it can pay off the cost of its manufacture. Seems fair, right? So now you have these human equivalent robots with human rights, who can be indentured? So clever corporate lawyers say, like, but if human equivalent beings can be indentured, why can't humans be indentured? Why shouldn't humans be free to indenture themselves if they want? So it's actually my nasty twist on the idea that inventing robots will enslave humanity, because it does enslave humanity, not because the robots rise up and enslave us, but because the usual people in power, the elites, the people who own the corporations, enslave everybody, using the robots as an excuse. So it's kind of nasty. I've been accused of writing a dystopia, but it has all these other utopian elements, and it has characters who are, of course, fighting the system, because you can't have a novel without a pirate, in my opinion. So, so there's a pirate who's fighting against the system. And we see a lot of other science fiction that's trying to do this. There's a television series called The Expanse, which I highly recommend, which is set several hundred years in the future of our solar system, and it's about colonizing the solar system and all of the different political groups who are vying to control different raw materials in the solar system. And so it's kind of, in a way, almost a critique of Star Trek's idea that, like, we overcome war, we overcome greed, and then everything is just awesome. I mean, I love Star Trek, but, like, come on, guys. And in The Expanse, there's all this utopian stuff. We have amazing technology. We're colonizing, like, the moons of Jupiter. It's super badass. But there's all these people who are working in mines on asteroids, who are deprived of gravity, who are deprived of light and water sometimes. So you have the same labor problems that we have now. And so again, it's partly utopian and partly dystopian. It's a realistic, or it's intending to be a realistic view. I had a picture earlier. I'm going to go back to it really briefly. Of Janelle Monáe, who's here to tell you that your dystopia has been canceled. Janelle Monáe's new album, Dirty Computer, has a terrific short movie that goes along with it that's kind of a futuristic, it's like a science fiction story. It's a frame story around a bunch of the music videos. And it's explicitly about how in a dystopian future, which is really the present, although it looks very kind of Logan's Run, everybody's wearing like shiny outfits and stuff, how in that dystopian world you can still find the ability to resist and to find friends and to try to change things. And so the frame story is actually super depressing. I'm not giving you a spoiler, but the frame story is that basically Janelle Monáe's character has been naughty. She's been breaking the rules in this oppressive society, and she's been kidnapped or imprisoned, and the bad guys are zapping all of her memories. So they're stealing all her memories of being a rebel, and each of those memories they watch as they nuke it, and it's the songs from the album, and those memories are what give her hope. And she's able to, well, I won't give away the ending, but the point is it has resistance, the resistance works, and it's an ambivalent future. It has, like I said, dystopian and utopian elements. So this is one way of getting out of the binary of dystopia and utopia, is to ask whose utopia it is. There's another way that I've become increasingly interested in my work and in other people's work, which is trying to think about futures in the context of deep time. So either the past, maybe even far in the past, or the far future. And this is, of course, incredibly important when you're thinking about things like climate change, which takes centuries and which has effects that will last potentially for millennia. So that's obviously very helpful. But also, I think, thinking about deep time, thinking about the present in the context of historical events that go back potentially thousands of years, helps get us out of this idea that there's going to be one type of future, or that when we tell stories about the future, that they kind of are isolated from the past. A lot of utopian and dystopian stories kind of start in the middle of a terrible future or like an awesome place, and you never understand how we got there. You never understand what the bridge is between the present day and this dark or this happy prediction. And so I'm interested in science fiction that gives us, and nonfiction that gives us a view of the future kind of embedded in the past. I love this picture. This is actually, I think this is art that's based on Rogue One, a scene in Rogue One. So this is just a planet, this is a planet that has been screwed over by the Empire for thousands of years. You've probably never heard of any place on Earth that's ever been screwed over and over by empires before. So this is just sci-fi, kids. But as you can see, the giant AT-AT, which is like the Empire's like mega tank, is kind of strolling into this ancient megastructure, which is about 5,000 years old, and the rebels are actually, they have their base in these ancient temples. Well, we don't even know if they're temples. They're like ziggurats or whatever. They look great. They're super awesome. And so this is like this great glimpse. I'm not saying that like Rogue One is the greatest movie ever, although it is pretty good. But it gives us that sense of, here's a dark future, because, you know, the whole frickin' galaxy is at war, so it's kind of dark. But it takes place in this history of oppression, where this planet, literally for 5,000 years, has been struggling with these same problems. So I love those kinds of details and stories. And there's all kinds of ways that we can play around with time. There is stuff like this. Again, to go back to Black Panther, one of the things that's really a delight about that film, other than the fact that it's just awesome, is that the concept design in that film, when you see Wakanda, when you see the characters who are from Wakanda, there's this deep history behind how they look, behind what their technology looks. It acknowledges this long history of sort of Pan-African design, and it's great. It gives you a technology that doesn't look like the Apple Store. It looks like it came from a place with thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history. So it's not just Wakanda, the Utopia out of nowhere. It's Wakanda embedded in a history of Africa, a history of colonialism, a history of a lot of other terrible stuff, but also a lot of fantastic stuff and a lot of triumph. But I was going to say, as I wind up here, that there's other ways that you can play around with deep time. There is a new series that a bunch of people have been talking about and that I just watched called Russian Doll. And everybody's like, yeah. Has anyone seen Russian Doll? A few people. It's on Netflix and on BitTorrent. So just saying, if you can't afford Netflix. And it's a story of a woman who is being forced. It's kind of a Groundhog Day thing. She's being forced to relive the same day over and over, but it's not just a day, and it kind of bleeds over into other times. And it's all about how she can choose to change her future by kind of revisiting her past again and again. And so you don't have to have, if you want to think about deep time, or you want to think about a utopia or a dystopia's relationship to time, it doesn't have to just be throwing in temples. You know, it can also be thinking about, how do characters relate to their own history, or how do they relate to a longer history. My own current projects, I have a novel coming out in September. I just turned it in, and I'm pretty excited. The cover looks badass. I like the cover. It's about time travel, and I explicitly wanted to think about these questions of, how do you talk about a future that's slightly dark in the context of a bunch of other historical moments. And so this is a world where time travel has always existed. We've known about it forever, or for as long as recorded history existed. So it's kind of like astronomy is in our world now. So it's an ancient, 1,000 years old kind of piece of scientific knowledge. So presumably the timeline has been heavily edited, because people have been time traveling just constantly for thousands of years. But it's actually quite hard to change the timeline, it turns out. Not only is it the case that you can't kill Hitler, because then Bitler comes along, and then Zitler, and they continue to exterminate large parts of Europe. So you can't do stuff like that, because it turns out Napoleon is like the third guy to do that. They tried to eliminate all these other guys, and then they finally got Napoleon, and they were like, fine, we'll just stop with Napoleon. So in order to actually change the timeline, you have to do what you do in the present to change the timeline. You have to go back in time, spend years and years organizing, trying to change laws, trying to change people's minds, and the main character is living in a near future where there are no abortion rights for women in the United States. I should just say there's no abortion rights in the United States. And she really wants to change that. So she's going back to the 19th century, trying to figure out if she can kind of meddle in the 19th century and make that better. But the problem is that she doesn't really get what the 19th century is like. She kind of imagines, the way we all do, that the 19th century was this dystopian time for women. You know, it was like all patriarchy, women were totally oppressed. And so she has kind of one idea about how she's going to deal with that. She gets back there and it's like, no, there's a ton of feminists that are doing all kinds of work. There are women who are holding sex parties and teaching each other about how to use the clitoris and like all the stuff that actually happened, but that hasn't, I mean, in our time, not in the alternate timeline. It's all stuff that did happen, but it's been kind of lost to history. It's been kind of erased, or it's barely ever remembered. And so when we think about, say, reproductive rights in a story like The Handmaid's Tale, it seems like, you know, this is just going to be a repeat of the Victorian era. It's going to be a dystopia with no elements of progress or utopia. But what she finds when she goes back to this 19th century world that's kind of a Handmaid's Tale type world in her mind is, nope, it's actually in some ways similar to her present. You know, there's a lot of people in power who are trying to deprive women of reproductive rights, but there's lots of women who are fighting against it. And that's, I'm not going to give you spoilers, but she meets some cool people in the 19th century. She makes some friends. So the other project I'm working on, which is a companion project, is a nonfiction book about 4 ancient abandoned cities and why people abandoned them. So I'm looking at, again, deep time. My apologies. So this is the artist who's doing the work for the book, Jason Thompson. He did a pencil. This is not the final version, but these are the 4 cities, and I think it looks really good. But he's like, no, it has to be fixed up and inked, and it's going to be much fancier in the final version, is all I should say. But I'm looking at these 4 cities and trying to place them in context of what caused people to leave them, what caused people to abandon these awesome cities, well, except for Pompeii, which was not really that awesome, but the rest of them were really awesome, big cities, sort of at the center of their civilizations, and people left. And you know, it's easy to tell a dystopian story about that, and in fact, it turns out it's really complicated. All of these cities were abandoned for a combination of environmental and political reasons. Some of them, like Çatalhöyük, which is a Neolithic city, took hundreds of years for it to be abandoned. It was not like people left overnight and said, like, screw this city, the politics are terrible. It's really complex, so that when you talk about, like, people will often say, like, Angkor is an example of civilization collapsing, as if it just all turned dystopian. And it's simply not true. I mean, like all of these other cities, Angkor went through, you know, decades of political instability and also environmental instability before people started to leave. And so for me, like, both of these books are ways of thinking about how deep time gives us a context for what we think of as a terrible world or a great world, or what we think of as a mix of both. And once you see political events or social events within the context of history, it helps kind of contextualize it and explain that, no, it's not just all bad or all good. People are trying to solve problems and screwing up. People are making progress and then going slightly backwards. And it's all kind of a mix. And we can't ever expect to reach outside of that dystopia into a perfect utopia. We're always going to get some good stuff and some bad stuff. And that's sort of humanity's general trajectory. So to finish up, I want to return to the question of, where does fiction fit into all of this? Where does storytelling fit into it? And I struggle with this a lot because I get asked by people who are doing political work, well, how does fiction, fit in? Like, how is fiction going to make the world better? You're telling stories about robots and, time travel. Like, how does that help? And I think that, storytelling works in two ways, right? So nonfiction storytelling about the future and what's to come gives us factual information that we absolutely need to have in order to plan for the future. We need to have climate models. We need to have policy plans. We need to have something like a Green New Deal. It doesn't have to be the Green New Deal, but it has to be some kind of plan, right? We need a fact-based way of looking toward the future. But with fiction, fiction doesn't provide us with facts usually. Fiction provides us with a kind of faith that we are going to continue on. And I think that that's a really important thing that it's doing kind of on the down low, kind of at an unconscious level. Because when you escape from that dystopian mode of storytelling, what you're promising your reader is, we're going to get to tomorrow. Humanity has a deep past, and it has a future. And you can have faith that there will be people on this planet in 1,000 years, and they are going to be living in a world that we build now. Maybe not such a great world if we continue with all of our efforts to change the climate to be really crappy for humans and other ecosystems that are currently here. And so that's what I see the task of fiction being, is kind of doing this underground work, like a symbolic work, or like the work of just opening us up to the possibility that there is going to be a long future, and now we need facts to plan for it. But right now, and I think at many times in history, when the future's been uncertain, when people are feeling hopeless and dystopian, it's very hard to believe in that. It's really hard to believe that there's going to be anything past 2020. It's hard to get into a mindset of thinking, oh, well, how will our decisions today impact people in 50 years or 200 years? And I think, again, like I said, I think fictional storytelling can open us up to thinking about that, and to thinking about the fact that, indeed, we will be here. We will be still part of the timeline. So I'm going to end there, and then we can do questions.
Does anyone have any questions? I can run the mic over to you. Yeah.
So you mentioned deep time and a future situated in the past. Do you have any thoughts about how the dystopias of 60 years ago, 70 years ago, and the apocalypses of 60 years, 70 years ago, what they teach us about where we're at today and where we might be going? For instance, in my parents' lifetime, there was the worry about Malthusian population collapse because we couldn't grow enough food, and then the Green Revolution saved us. There was the very real fear of nuclear Armageddon, which they grew up under. There was the very real fear of the hole in the ozone layer, right? That it would be this insolvable environmental issue that would eventually, impair habitability. I think that was a plot point in Max Headroom, actually.
And so, ozone death.
Yeah. So do you feel like that, looking at these apocalypses we don't worry about in the same way anymore, what does that tell us about the ones we do worry about and where we're at?
So I would kind of go back to the point I made earlier about how dystopias are really about the present. So when you look back at sort of dystopias of the 1950s, they're often atomic dystopias. Dystopias of the 1960s are often things like Soylent Green, where it's like people are starving because there's no food, there's overpopulation. And these were problems that preyed on people's minds. There was a book that came out, I want to say it's in the 60s, called The Population Bomb, which sounds like a sci-fi book, right? And it actually was kind of a sci-fi book and also very racist. But at the time, people loved it. And it was all about how the evil brown people were outbreeding the white people and also eating all of our food, and what are we going to do? Oh my. I really am not joking. That is a good summary of the book. But I also urge you to check it out because you should make your own opinion, I guess. But anyway, The Population Bomb inspired tons of sci-fi because people were like, oh, it's a great dystopia. We're all, going to be eating each other, and which indeed is what Soylent Green is about. You remember Soylent Green is made of people. So because they're eating each other because, of all the bad things. So I think that what it tells us is that, these stories are ways of imaginatively working out fears in the present. Atomic bomb stories are coming back, and I think we know why. And I think, it's interesting that you see these recurring dystopias. Another dystopia that keeps coming back is the zombie dystopia. Zombie dystopias go all the way back to the 1940s, and they kind of crop up. Once in a while, you'll get just like a huge bunch of zombie dystopias. Like there were a bunch in the 60s and 70s. We obviously have a lot now. I'll let you figure out why that is. But yeah, we definitely have cycles of dystopian storytelling.
I really enjoyed your talk. It was so nice. I'm also excited to hear you have another book coming out. I didn't actually know it was so soon. I wanted to ask a little bit about how you think as a writer about resolution, especially because you talked a lot about introducing a lot of ambiguity, right? Between not everyone's good or bad, and it's both dystopic and utopian. So just how you think about still providing resolution and a through line to your narrative.
Yeah, so I actually really like happy endings. So when I was given that assignment to have a story that was uplifting, I was able to say it's gonna have a happy ending, but it's not all the way happy, of course. But the story is not happy necessarily. So I like having a resolution where it's obvious that the characters have come to an end of a particular phase, like maybe they've completed an adventure, or they've fallen in love, or they've found a new home. And so we all have those moments in our lives where you're like, oh, I got the thing. And it's like, yeah, it's a happy ending, except then you have to wake up tomorrow and you still have to go to work and all that kind of stuff. But I like leaving characters at that moment where there's a sense of completion, because I think it's satisfying in storytelling. And I really also like to do self-contained novels. I love reading other people who write series, but I always have standalone stories. I don't think I'll ever do a series, because I just like that feeling of I read the thing and it was all just one chunk and there won't be any more, except in your own head. I would love people to write fanfic. That's super duper. But I don't. I like having that moment of rest with the characters.
Do you think our society today is kind of modeling George Orwell's 1984 and a fusion of that and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World?
It's like you're pitching the present to me. It's well, it's going to be a little bit surveillance and a little bit crazy drugs. I don't think so. I do think that one of the things that's great about 1984, not so much, I feel like people don't talk enough about Brave New World, but people talk a lot about 1984 because a lot of our language around surveillance culture comes from it. And so that's actually a great tool of both dystopian and utopian storytelling. One of the things you see now is, I'm going to just keep talking about Black Panther forever, but a lot of people now do this, in triumph, right? And it's become a symbol for solidarity and resistance to bad stuff. This is Wakanda, by the way, in case you need to join. Anyways, so I think that we get language from those kinds of stories that help us describe our present. And Orwell's scenario is not exactly what we have today. I think Black Mirror, a lot of the stories in Black Mirror are closer to the kind of media dystopia that we have currently. Orwell's idea was a kind of a top-down surveillance where it's one entity, allegedly Big Brother, but really a bunch of ministries that are watching everyone. Whereas what we have now is more like the panopticon model where everybody watches everyone, right? That's the social media model. Yay! Everybody watches everyone. Don't get paranoid. So I think that so I think that idea has evolved. And I think Mr. Robot is another kind of popular TV story that kind of plays with those same issues in a very different way.
Here, while I walk the mic over, I have one question. Since I have the mic, I guess I get to ask it.
Just appropriate the mic.
So we have a lot of grad students who are taking part in this San Diego 2049 program from different parts of campus. Not all of them, I think most of them want to write science fiction. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot more science fiction writers being employed by corporations or governments to advise on the future or try to offer insights into where we're going. So I was curious, one, what you make of that phenomenon, if you've done some of that yourself, and then advice you have for people who are using science fiction or want to think about how science fiction can inform their public policy work or their work in social activism or climate science, how they can use science fiction to kind of help clarify or advance what they're trying to do.
It's a really good question. I mean, there's now like a whole kind of job, a type of professional career, which is like a futurist or a forecast expert or foresight expert. And some of them do advise corporations, and basically what will happen is, I've done this like maybe twice, and I didn't really like it. But you'll have like you'll get some money, usually like a ridiculous amount of money, and then you'll talk to them on the phone for a couple of hours about their products, but also about like where you think the market is going in a particular area, what are the kids doing, that kind of stuff. And the other area that I actually did a tiny bit of work in was similar kind of work for three-letter agencies, like intelligence agencies, which I did mostly because I just was like, I want to meet some people from the NSA. That sounds kind of interesting, like in a sociological way. And that involved, that was at a time when I was writing a lot about hacking. And so that was them wanting to know, like, what are the bad guys doing? And in my opinion, they were not bad guys. So that ended very quickly. So that I was not helpful to them. But I do think that there is a ton of room for really good futurist work with government and policy and science. I think once you get into the corporate sphere, there's so many, it's so opaque. You don't know kind of who you're serving and where your ideas are going, and everything is NDA, and they own everything that you say. In Canada, there's a lot of foresight experts who work with the government on trying to create things that are kind of like the Green New Deal, like trying to create policy plans that aren't just like, what are we going to do in the next quarter, but what do we want to have happen to the nation over the next 50 years or the next 100 years? How do we want to do land development? Like, I feel like land development is such a huge issue. It's something, and urban development, those are things that urban development can take hundreds of years. I mean, a lot of cities, not this city, but lots of cities are hundreds of years old. I'm from Irvine, so that's really not old. But there, and of course, land management is something that takes place over hundreds of years. So I think there is a good role to play there. It's just a question of, like I said, whose interests are you serving? So I think that I could easily see someone who wants to write science fiction taking a lot of jobs like that, and that's fine. That's great. Like, if you can trick someone into giving you money to like write about the future, do it. And then, and that, I mean, it's legit. Like, being a writer is really hard. Like, sometimes you take jobs that are like maybe not your favorite job ever, but then that gives you some money to write the stuff you really want to write. So, yeah.
So you just mentioned zombies, and I was wondering, you had said how it keeps cropping up over time. Most of the like dystopia themes you've discussed are like, okay, there's actually reason to fear that. Surveillance, things like that. Zombies, it doesn't seem like there's a realistic fear we have of a zombie apocalypse. So why do you think it is that this keeps popping up?
It's a good question. I mean, there are other kind of dystopias that crop up that are not as realistic, like alien-type dystopias, like War of the Worlds being like one of the very first examples of a kind of alien-authored dystopia. So sometimes in our fantasies, we have monsters that stand in for an actual fear, right? So right now, I think a lot of zombie stories are dealing with fears of pandemic, or I think fears of mass migration. And so you see lots of zombie stories where it's basically that, you know, they're even called the infected. You know, it's just a fear that in an urban area, disease can spread so quickly, or that it's just this giant shambling mass of zombies that are coming in from who knows where, which again, like I said, I think definitely touches on a lot of the fears right now around immigration and climate refugees. But if you look at the origins of the zombie film, which I have because I love zombie films, one of the earliest zombie films in the States, as far as I know, is I Walked with a Zombie, which is from the 1940s, and it's set on St. Sebastian, which is a Caribbean island. And it's about what happens after the white plantation family that basically owns most of the land has kind of fallen into chaos, and all of the formerly enslaved people have kind of risen up and are now messing with the white people who used to be their masters and turning one of them in particular into a zombie. It's unclear whether she's really a zombie or not. Sorry, spoilers for a movie that's really old. But it's explicitly about colonialism. And the zombies are, you know, white people partly in the story, which is what's so amazing because it's from the 1940s. And it's these monsters that have preyed on the population, and there's now this revenge that's happening where the black population is able to control the zombies. But there's other zombie narratives that deal with that too much later. I mean, Night of the Living Dead is about race as well. Like, just go back and watch that movie. It's kind of dark at the end. Okay, I'm going to give away the ending. How many people have seen Night of the Living Dead? Okay, you guys, I'm about to give away the end. So the hero of the movie is a black guy. He's the only person who stays sane. All the white people are like, blah! And he's like, look, we've got to like board up the windows. We've got to do all this stuff. So he survives because he knows what to do. And at the end, the cops come and they shoot him. Yeah, 1969. That was when that film came out. So made by a white guy too. So it's the zombie narrative keeps coming back because we keep having these same problems. And a lot of the problems have to do with populations moving around and how one population treats the other population. And it's just zombies seem to be like the way we want to tell that story. But also aliens. You get to see that sort of story a lot with aliens too. But zombies especially. Night of the Living Dead. So good.
Thank you. This is terrific. You know, when you were talking about your book, I was wondering whether all dystopias don't have some turning point in them where things went radically wrong. So you were describing, for example, you know, the story of indentured robots, and then all of a sudden the lawyers say, well, why not humans? Mm-hmm. And, you know, it seems reasonable, but then after the fact you realize that's totally crazy. Mm-hmm. And things just go off, right? Is that true?
Well, nobody thinks it's crazy, right? Because it makes good economic sense to have people be indentured. And because they enter into indenture freely, okay? The laws around it are called the Human Rights Indenture Laws for a reason. It's your human right. So I think that, you know, I was very self-conscious about trying to build a history into it. Not all dystopias have that. One of the most famous dystopias of the past, I don't know, decades is The Road, which was made into a movie, I think with Viggo in it, Viggo Mortensen. I don't know, some slabby white guy. So I'm sorry, he's good. I like him. Anyway, what happened to make that world happen? We don't know. It's just like things are on fire. And I think, you know, and that's part of the point is that we don't know. It could be anything. And I'm not saying that it has to have, you know, a good story doesn't have to have that. But I do think that that is one of the problems with dystopian storytelling is that we don't get enough of a sense of what happened in between the present and that future. And we need that bridge. Like, I think that that's what helps us understand how trends in our present day might go terribly wrong. If we want it to function as a warning, we need to have that sense of what that turn was. So I think some dystopias do, a lot of dystopias don't. Because part of the pleasure of dystopia is just seeing everything be really screwed up. And so, I mean, we have an appetite for that. I mean, it's part of what propels a lot of our desire for these stories. And so, yeah, I think that that's one of the troubles with dystopia, I guess, is that they don't all have that moment. And even if they do, sometimes it's quite silly. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions.
She had her hand up for a while, yeah.
So I've been listening. One of the things that I do is I try to work with people to get them to think and to acknowledge the ambiguity between dystopia and utopia. And a lot of times I'm working with young people, and I'm wondering if there's any like YA fiction / nonfiction that comes to mind. And then also wanted to tell you that I'm reading right now The People's Future of the United States, which I think is a good...
it's such a great collection. Yeah, no, that's a really, yeah.
Yeah, and Sorry to Bother You deals with the... Yeah,
yes,
without spoiling the end.
So it's funny because I wanted to talk about Sorry to Bother You, which
but
is like it's not, so it's weird because I was like, is it a mix of utopia and dystopia? And that was what I was kind of stuck on, because I feel like it is, in the sense that there's this, I don't know if I should, anyway, there is a rebellion against the bad guys, but like is it manufactured? Like it's so, anyway, I love that movie so much. Anyway, so YA stuff, it's tough. There's a lot of dystopian YA. I mean, there's stuff like classic stuff like The Hunger Games or the Uglies books, and oftentimes the element that isn't dystopian is something that's a sort of resistance to whatever the crackdown is. But I don't know enough about YA to be able to like give a good recommendation. I write for grown-ups, and so I'm sorry about that. But there is a ton of great stuff, as I'm sure you already know. So yeah, I'm going to be thinking about this now for the next 2 hours. I'll try to post about it later. So she had her hand up too.
So I haven't been doing any much reading lately because work gets in the way. But in the old days, there seemed to have been a will to critique that I'm not seeing so much now of the movies or any indication. And I think that's tied a little bit to your notion of this ahistoricity that's attached to the dystopian / utopian model. Mm-hmm. Of viewing the world as the connection. Those historical connections are actually signs that there's a will to critique not only the present but the future, mm-hmm. and to do it in an intelligent way. Another thing too, there seems to be something that's covert about trying to symbolize something that could be otherwise much more explicit. The zombie, mm-hmm. Metaphor, mm-hmm. for example. At what point do the fact that corporations, for example, are hiring authors to give them leads into how their products are going to fare in the future, to me tells me that there's an arena where there's a will to critique, mm-hmm. but for a very specific purpose. But at what point does the rest of us, the general public, are authors viewing the general public as willing to critique and willing to be presented with, a solution to the problem, or yes, the happy ending, or yes, the dystopian bad ending if we go down a particular road? Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a lot of authors, and I think a lot of mass media too, that visual media, or even like Janelle Monáe's album, Dirty Computer, which is such a complicated story. I mean, even just the album itself without the movie. And the movie Sorry to Bother You that we were just talking about is another great example of a film that really it gives us a dystopia, but it's like just as the dystopia is starting to happen, or just as it's becoming widely acknowledged, I should say. It's always been happening, but it's like now kind of reaching public awareness beyond a small community. And so it does have that whole invitation to critique. I mean, it's a very critical film. And I think that the series by N.K. Jemisin, Broken Earth, which just like broke all the records and won like every Hugo Award and won the Nebula and everything. My novel Lost to Her novel, which was totally fine with me because those books are so incredible. I kind of wanted to bring her up because she's working with deep time. Like her novels are about a civilization that was built on top of an ancient civilization, and they're going through these like 1,000-year cycles of extinctions and horrible, horrible changes in the environment, climate changes and things like that. And it's very much about how does that deep time inform the dystopia of the present. And they are very dystopian, but they also have a kind of utopian side to them as well, because the characters who are resisting do find each other and do manage to come up with a way kind of around some of the problems. And some of the problems are like deep time problems. Like they're solving problems that are like thousands of years old, which is kind of badass. And so I think it still is happening. And especially right now, we're in kind of like a moment of flowering in science fiction storytelling that is really critical and political. Partly because, we're living in really, tumultuous times. And so people are kind of rising to the occasion. But also the publishing industry is changing a lot. There's a lot more diversity in who's writing. And so that's giving us a fuller understanding of utopia and dystopia. Because as I said, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. And once you have many diverse voices saying like, by the way, actually your utopia really sucks for me, like that's actually really important, and that's a good check, and that's part of that critique. So I think we're still doing okay with critique. Could do better. I'm sorry? Yeah, the Broken Earth trilogy, yeah. And the author's name is N.K. Jemisin. They're so good. And also, Sorry to Bother You is really good. And that's a movie, so you can see it really quickly.
Well, thank you all for your questions. And can we give Annalee Newitz another round of applause for joining us tonight?